Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video I wish to talk a little bit about the sources of conspiracy theories. Not the conspiracy theories themselves, but rather their sources. But anyway, how can you talk about conspiracy theories without properly camouflaging yourself? Which I did, right? So let's begin. A lot of things I'm going to be talking about today I've already mentioned in my video about Star Wars, of all things, and I'll put a link in the description to this video with a proper timestamp because it was basically a digression for the whole Star Wars thing, but it's only a few minutes long, but you'll see what I'm saying. And there I explore one particular aspect of what I'm going to be talking about today in more detail, so it would help if you'd watch it. Maybe even before this video, maybe after, it doesn't really matter actually. But anyway, so it was only one aspect of this problem which I would further in this video call internal aspect or internal source. We're talking about two sources. But yet afterwards, in recent months, I've read quite a lot of, well, not a lot, but some blogs in Russian language, in Russian internet, and yes, not everything on the Russian internet is written by toxic high school students. There are actually quite a few of intellectuals and quite an advanced ones, so I really like their ideas, so I wish to repeat some of them here with some of my own additions, right? And the second aspect that I've come up with after kind of generalizing what I've read, I would call external. Right, so the first one I've already talked about was internal, and the second one, the new one, so to speak, would be external. So it's almost like the other side of coin. So they're related. It's like more or less one source, but it can be subdivided, roughly speaking, into two sources, which I'm talking about in this video, right? So let's separate them and kind of try to flesh them out in a bit more detail. So firstly, I wish to repeat what I've talked about in that video about Star Wars, just for completion, perfectionist type of thing, you know, to have everything here, although I still refer to this previous video where there are more details, which I didn't include here. All right, so in this respect, in this aspect of conspiracy theories, the internal one, which I've talked about previously, the conspiracy theory is a way of rationalizing the suffering, right? Some sort of disappointment, dissatisfaction, where this disappointment or suffering I'm talking about comes from ultimately feeling of injustice or feeling of defeat of any sort, really. Like, it might be, of course, most of the conspiracy theories are about society in general, like political groups or scientific groups or whatever groups, religious groups possibly. But it actually works on all scales. Like, you can think about even the families, like individual interpersonal relationships. Like, imagine a completely out of the blue example. Like, imagine you have a child and you notice some strange behavior of theirs, like they start speaking, vocalizing some peculiar ideas, and you observe that and you say, I see, it's your stupid uncle's influence, you know? So again, you feel this feeling of disappointment, like your child doesn't satisfy you, well, in a normal sense of the word. But anyway, and you kind of infer some evil, malevolent presence behind this, right? So it was uncle who influenced your child, or auntie, whatever, in a bad way, so they behave like that because of that, and not because you're a bad parent, let's say. Because, well, you consider yourself to be a good parent, so why would your child behave in this way that you don't approve? It's because of this malevolent presence, right? Of your uncle or whatever, their uncle, I mean. So yeah, and it happens a lot, I would say, with narcissists. Like, narcissists really tend to cling to conspiracy ideas because, well, they consider themselves infallible, so everything bad that happens to them should come from some malicious agency, right? Some evil conspiracy behind the scenes that kind of destroy their lives in various manners. And I've had a personal experience with one like really prominent narcissist in well, I wouldn't say where, but some of you probably might understand what I'm talking about. So there was a collective. I mean, what I'm talking about, it might happen not only in families, but in collectives of any sort, basically, right? That's the general statement. But my example was, there was a collective of people who did like a certain project, let's say, together. And there was a narcissist in there, like a very prominent one, who, like, I would almost say psychopathic narcissist, but anyway, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't care really. But what they did was, when to everyone it became obvious that they're basically sabotaging the whole initiative with their own like screwed personality and the way they were dealing with things, and everyone said to them, to this guy, like, what are you doing? You are wrong. Stop this. Let's do stuff differently. And they said, well, what the hell are you talking about? Everything's fine. Everything's cool. And then when a certain amount of people moved away from the project, including myself, because obviously it was not even, the problem wasn't even recognized by the guy, they said, it's an engineered crisis, you know, there's some sort of conspiracy behind this all. So yeah, like, there you go. And you can probably you can think of some examples of that in your own life, although I'm not sure if you can relate to that, but I would imagine you do, if you have a certain experience in life, at least. Okay? Anyway, so what I'm saying is, it's this feeling of injustice that, for example, this narcissist felt, that they did everything right in their own eyes, narcissistic eyes, and so it must be the result of their failure of everything, essentially, was the result of some evil backdoor whatever plot against them, you know, some sort of idea like that. So it's this fundamental, well, not fundamental, but basic idea of, like, we have lost, but it wasn't fair. You know, we did well, and still we have lost. And what does it mean? It means the game is rigged, fundamentally, right? Because we should have won, but we've lost. So it means the whole system is crooked or something like that, you know? So this is one of the fundamental, this internal source of conspiracy theories, I believe so, at least. And when I say we have lost, I don't even necessarily mean the exact person or the collective who invents the conspiracy theory. It might be some other agency that have lost, some other power structure, but through empathy, this other collective that produces conspiracy theory kind of relates to that other entity, whatever it is, that have lost, you know, in some abstract sense. So again, but it's still what I would call internal source of conspiracy theories, because here we focus on the loser, so to speak, on the agency that have lost something in some competition, all very abstractly speaking. So they invent, or some empathizing agencies invent, some conspiracy theory to rationalize this loss, you know, even though it might have been objectively determined in the first place, right? But for some reasons, like sympathy or whatever, we tend to reject this objectivity and tend to some other explanations instead, let's say. And it's understandable because, well, again, relating to my personal experience, I'm not sure it's viable for all the people, but I think it's true for all the people in that way or another. And like, just the degree varies. So people tend to root for the underdog, you know, for the people who were well, somehow badly treated, or the outcome wasn't good for them, etc., etc. So yeah, again, it's a fundamental human herd type of feeling, like, you know, we're one collective, essentially. We're human beings, etc. So no one should be left behind, blah blah blah, those kinds of feelings. And I think they're very natural for everyone. So even if the party that has lost were the bad guys, or even without air quotes, bad guys, like genuinely bad guys, there's still going to be some sympathy towards them because they've lost, you know, even though they kind of deserve that, but still, well, they've lost, and it's better that they didn't. I mean, in the sense that, well, hopefully you understand what I mean. So, and there's a lot of examples of thinking like of that sort. And in my video, The Great Wall and the Abduction of Europa, I kind of was close to this realm that I'm describing right now, where I've said that witnessing the crumbling of certain power structure, whether it is societal structure, political structure, economical structure, or even a person, you know, or a societal group, like a person is also a power structure. Again, see my previous videos where I've talked about this many times. So yeah, again, seeing any type of structure like that crumbling invokes certain negative feelings in us, which we try to rationalize with the help of conspiracy theories. This is essentially what I'm talking about when I'm saying that there is internal aspect to the source of conspiracy theory. So there is more or less a single source, this situation of defeat, and there's an internal aspect where we focus on someone who has lost in this defeat, and this is one aspect of the explanation, right? And again, there are many examples, like well, maybe this is not exactly a good example, but I might think about Hannibal, you know, versus Rome. So people root for Hannibal, you know, he was kind of a cool guy. So maybe there are even some conspiracy theories about how Hannibal have lost due to some treason or whatever. Then obviously Caesar was killed, even though he kind of had it coming, you know. He wasn't a good guy, in my opinion. Like, he was a tyrant, more or less, and again, egomaniacal type of guy who basically destroyed the more or less normally functioning republic to fit his own needs, etc. Then there are Nazis, of course, you know, and Nazi base in Antarctica. Even though Nazis were really bad guys, there are still people kind of intuitively, on some level, rooting for them, you know. Well, they've lost, but they were so cool, you know. There was something cool about them. Like, there was order, at least. There are many things you might praise about the Nazis. I mean, socialists might adore Nazis. Well, Nazis were national socialists. They were socialists in the first place. So there was order, central planning. There was this symbolism of, like, tradition, even though tradition only appeared in the 19th century. There was imagery of this supposedly inheritance of antique ideals, which more or less all of the Europe and the whole Western world is built upon, etc. So yeah, so people are rooting for them, again, on some vague level. And so they say, well, Hitler actually didn't die, you know, he fled to Argentina or whatever. And Nazis have bases in Antarctica and on the moon, etc. Well, you know those stories, right? Damn. Corona. Okay, then there are plenty of conspiracy theories of that sort about the Soviets, which are also socialistic, but not only because of that, but also, you know, there's this sentiment. I'm not sure if you know that, but a lot of people in Russia, and in general, in post-Soviet Union, even in my country, a lot of people are still fans of Stalin, for example. So they said, oh, Stalin did everything correctly. If only Stalin wasn't poisoned or whatever, or betrayed by the party, by the evil doers in the party, the Soviet Union would be a cool state, you know, etc., etc. So it's the very same type of thinking, like Soviets have lost, Stalin has lost, but there was an evil conspiracy that made this happen because Stalin was a good guy in this sort of thinking, at least. Only, I should add, actually, not at least, but only. And then again, there's plenty of other examples, like Gaddafi, this Libyan idiot, who basically an idiot dictator, a very typical one. So there's a conspiracy that, oh, the West despised him because he brought his country to prosperity, etc. So they wanted to remove him so that the people in the West wouldn't see any alternatives to their evil regime or whatever. Blah, blah, blah. So there are many examples like that. And even on individual level, you might say, when we look at people like famous, powerful people, let's say, their deaths or bad treatment of them from other people, like again, poisoning or whatever, any sort of mistreatment, might be explained by conspiracy theories. And you might think about the conflict between Edison and Tesla. So there's a lot of people rooting for Tesla because Edison was rich and powerful and Tesla died basically being poor. So he's the underdog. So we're rooting for him and invent conspiracy theories against him to explain, rationalize this defeat fundamentally. Then we had Mozart and Salieri, the composers. There's even a play of Russian poet Alexander Pushkin about this, a pretty famous one, at least in Russia. Then there's Kennedy assassination, like we're rooting for Kennedy because he was just out of the blue killed, and so even that thing alone adds to him this, you know, aura of being a martyr, etc., and being a good guy. So he was the ultimate underdog. He just died, you know, randomly. So yeah, so people say, oh, there was a conspiracy of CIA or whatever, FBI against Kennedy, or Rothschilds and Rockefellers and whatnot, and they killed Kennedy, etc. Even though, I mean, rationally, objectively speaking, it could have been a lone shooter, or how you call it. It's a meme in America, right? The lone. Even in X-Files, there's this magazine that these guys publish, which is called The Lone Shooter, I think. And then there was a cool, I would say cool, TV series, Dark Skies, also about aliens. I actually recommend you to watch it. It's pretty cool. Also from the 90s, roughly, where they kind of reinterpreted the history from the point of view that aliens exist. So the events in the 60s proceed as they do because aliens exist, and it's kind of cool. It's kind of the Forrest Gump type of attitude in this respect, you know. Okay, so what was I talking about? Yeah, famous people. So yeah, there's plenty of examples like that, and oh, damn, that it actually progresses, if you noticed. Corona, I mean. But anyway, so there's a curious counterexample to those famous people, conspiracy kinds of things, where a guy isn't even supposed to exist in the first place. And it's a really interesting example, and it's about Napoleon. So there is a famous meme in Europe, at least, that Napoleon was a solar myth. Just let it sink for a second. So a guy named Jean-Baptiste Perret in 1827 published a pamphlet which was called Comme quoi Napoléon n'a jamais existé, which can be roughly translated as if well, it was actually translated in this way factually, as if Napoleon never existed. So yeah. was a kind of a funny example. And he actually brings forth a lot of cool arguments. So it's a really solid theory. So you can subscribe to that easily. I mean, speaking about the past is a construct. Like, the past doesn't exist, strictly speaking. I mean, where is the past? I see only present, right? Even the present is constructed. I mean, I construct my own body. It's my own perception that creates those things in certain sense. But again, see my videos about mythology as cultural basis, where I speak about how objects are created, and stories of history was the other one, where I specifically talk about history. I'm really sorry about that, but maybe I'll die in a couple of days or something. Okay, well then, I hope at least my channel would get like 10,000 extra subscribers. You know, when an artist dies, that usually is what happens. Okay, so just as an example, one argument that the guy brings forth in favor of his position, well, it's kind of a mocking pamphlet on some level, but at the same time, it's very convincing, like very convincing. Like he says, the very name Napoleon is basically the name Apollo, you know, the Greek god of the sun and arts and intellectual stuff. So yeah, it's a really strong statement, I would say. But yeah, it's a very curious example of this sort. All right, so now we've discussed this internal side of things that I've pretty much already talked about in my Star Wars video. Again, link in the description. And let's talk about the external aspect of the same problem. So here, in internal aspect, we focused on the loser, and in the external aspect, we'll focus on the winner. And here, I wish to start actually from the example where there's an American historian or historian, whatever you prefer, Daniel Pipes, and he has a book which is called Conspiracy and blah blah blah, some long sentence, which I don't care to remember. So the book is from 1997, all right, so it's relatively recent. And it's a crappy book, to be honest, but it brings forth an interesting observation, which I would like to repeat, that he analyzed, or supposedly analyzed, various conspiracy theories, and he came to the conclusion that most of the time, these winners, so to speak, which we focus on in this external aspect, are either the British, the Americans, the Freemasons, or the Jews. And in his calculations, although I have no idea how he calculated the number of Freemasons, but he says that it's roughly 6% of all humanity, right? So the question he asks is, why is such a minority of people causes such a majority of conspiracy theories about them? And so, again, why is there no Muslims or Indians or Africans or whatever? And I should add here that today we are for diversity, so let's invent. I mean, I would ask all those lefty SJWs to invent more conspiracy theories about Muslims, black people, certainly, East Asians, Australians probably, Native Americans, South American, well, you name it. I mean, Inuits, whatever. This is really what we lack today in our culture, if you know what I mean. Okay, so what was it? Yeah, so the conclusion that he arrives from this example, which I would agree with, although with caveats, you know, I would give you my own conclusion, because it includes his conclusion as a special case, but he is wrong in certain things, and I'll tell you which ones. So the conclusion is that only really powerful people induce or invoke or whatever conspiracy theories about themselves. All right? So, roughly speaking, Jews are powerful. They are really overrepresented in, let's say, bankers, artists, like intellectual people, and things like that. So there's a conspiracy theory why that is the case, right? Well, this is a very obvious example which everyone should be able to follow. So only really powerful people induce these conspiracy theories about themselves. And this is correct, what, I mean, Pipes said. But what he is mistaken about, or rather he was right about back then, in this particular moment in time when the book was written, which the end of the 90s. And he says there in particular that Russians are somehow not a subject of conspiracy theories. Nobody has any conspiracy theories about Russians. Nobody had back then. Despite, he adds, that they're the largest country in the world. So how's that possible? I mean, they have all those resources, natural resources, and nobody cares about them in terms of conspiracy theories. But I would add that it was only the case when he wrote this. Because, well, obviously, right now, Russia became much more powerful than in the end of the 90s, mostly because, I mean, people attribute this to the price of oil, etc., but really what it came about because of, so the reason that Russia became more rich and powerful today than at the end of the 90s is because of the liberal reforms that the Putin actually produced or initiated in the first half of the 2000s, in like 2000-2005 or even 8 roughly. So there were quite a bunch of liberal reforms which allowed Russia to become much more rich and powerful in like a decade after, right? Even though the corrupt government kind of makes it poorer and poorer still. But anyway, by the way, with the help of Putin himself afterwards. So anyway, there are, because Russia became more powerful and rich, now conspiracies about Russia today. I mean, in the US, Russian hackers, Russian agents everywhere, like the elections are rigged because of that, etc. Fake news, RT.com, etc. Blah, blah, blah. Russians are everywhere, so there's a conspiracy. And in the European Union even, I mean, people say, well, it's a Russian agent of influence, whoever it is, some rich dude. Well, there are actually, indeed, rich dudes who are agents of Russian influence, like former Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder. He is definitely an agent of Russian influence, or anyway. And in many, or actually all, maybe except China, neighbors of Russia, there is the same sentiment that definitely a lot of guys look suspicious, almost as if they were agents of Russian influence. And so, yeah, today Russia is perceived as a more powerful structure than previously, so much more conspiracy theories come about Russia, modern Russia. But even more conspiracy theories about Russia existed in 19th century, when arguably Russia was the strongest. The Russian Empire was actually much larger than today. It was definitely the largest country in the world. Well, maybe British Empire, I mean, in terms of if you include India, Australia, Canada, and places like that, maybe it was larger, but not guaranteed. I don't know the facts. Maybe they were roughly comparable. But anyway, so there were plenty of conspiracy theories about Russia back then. Again, Marx wrote some completely idiotic rubbish about Russian diplomacy back then. I mean, Marx was a Russophobe, Russianphobe, how do you say it in English? As any decent British agent, basically. You see, I'm also an adept of the conspiracy theory that British agents are everywhere. And I admit that, yeah. Marx was definitely a British agent, like, there's no doubt about it at all. All right, so Or there was a meme, again, a conspiracy theory in 19th century about the will of Peter the Great, where Peter the Great is the reformer, the famous Russian emperor from the beginning of 18th century, who basically modernized Russia and made it a proper European state. He instituted a lot of cool stuff. He made reforms in the army, in the courts, in everywhere, basically. So yeah. And in 1820, I think, 1812, I'm sorry, like when Russia basically defeated Napoleon, there appeared this conspiracy theory about this, well, roughly speaking, protocol of Zionist, how do you say it? Wise men? Whatever. But about Russia. So it was a protocol of Russian wise men, this will of Peter the Great. And it only reinforced its significance during the Crimean War in 1850s and Russo-Turkish War in 1870s, where basically the Russian army destroyed everyone. Well, not completely, but gave a good fight, you know. In Crimean War, it was basically the 0th World War, so to speak. So everyone was against Russia. The largest states of the time, which were the British and the French, and also the Ottomans, by the way, were against Russia, and they couldn't beat it. They couldn't beat Russia in the Crimean War. It was basically a, how do you say it? Not a victory, not a defeat. What's the third option? I don't know. Whatever. Like, formally, Russia was beaten, but it wasn't really beaten. That's what I'm saying. So the whole world couldn't beat Russia, and so this conspiracy theory resurfaced about some evil doings of Russian people, etc. So I hope this gives you a good perspective on what I'm talking about, this external aspect of conspiracy theories, where you see that someone is powerful and you say, well, it's not as simple as it seems. There must be something bad about them, whoever they are. There must be some, again, evil conspiracy behind this all that made them so strong, right? And there may have been, I don't know. And again, examples like that are numerous, like Venetians in the Middle Ages and during the how do you say it? Renaissance, yeah. I thought it was some different word in English. Venetians, then Jesuits. Like, Jesuits were hated all over Europe, basically, in like 16th, 17th century, etc. So there was also a conspiracy theory behind them, etc., etc., behind the Pope, I mean, Vatican, etc. So all of that, those are just the examples. And in the current day and age, there's a conspiracy theory behind China, like Chinese. I mean, look at the American culture. Like, there is a plenty of people obsessed with the problem of China, so to speak. And again, it even creeps into the governmental regulations. Like when people say, "Oh, China nowadays controls everything," etc., etc. Although I would claim, from my conspiracy theory point of view, that it's the British, because the China is a British colony to this day. Like, the China only appeared like 70 years ago, and the British, they were around for like 300 years ago. So China is intellectually, it's very poor, whereas the British have been conducting mass-scale propaganda operations for centuries. Like, look at the European revolutions of 1848, where the British basically lit on fire all of Europe, literally. I mean, Communist Manifesto published in London mysteriously and spread all over Europe, except Britain, you know. That looks not suspicious at all, you know. And China is communist today, or supposedly communist, and there's obviously ties with Hong Kong and all the banks from Britain. I mean, the Britain dominates European financial markets. They hold like 60 or even 70% of all the money basically in Europe. So, well, who could have thought, you know? But anyway, that was a pathetic digression. So there's also a conspiracy theory, again, about cultural Marxists, plural, among the, roughly speaking, Western right, you know, the conservatives and whatever. They're saying, oh, cultural Marxists control the media, they control the universities and all the intellectual life, and this is indeed the case, so they are the winners. So what follows from that? There's a conspiracy behind this, right? How else can it be? So hopefully it illustrates my point, right? All right, what else I wanted to say? Oh yeah, well, obviously all kinds of conspiracies about the rich, like the corporations, the this Bilderberg Club or whatever. Bill Gates is a really famous example. Mark Zuckerberg, he's an alien or whatever, crypto subterranean troglodyte, you name it. So again, those are just examples which show you, hopefully, this external aspect, that if someone is powerful, we want to rationalize it because we think it's unfair. We feel that this power imbalance, that a lot of people are without power and this small group of people is with a lot of power. So this means that the game is rigged fundamentally, so to speak, and they gained their power in an unfair manner through some evil conspiracies, through some plots and assassinations and bribery, etc. Even though it's actually objectively true, there's a lot of assassinations and bribery taking place, but I'm just exploring the cultural and psychological roots of the situation. I'm not talking about the objective, you know, way of things. I actually don't think such a thing exists in the first place as objective state of things. Again, it's all constructed, basically. All right, so let's conclude this rant, even though I'll add some things later. So I claim that there are two main sources of conspiracy theories, even though they can be, roughly speaking, united into a single source. And those are internal and external. And what does that mean is that, well, they're just really two aspects of the same problem. The problem is that somebody has lost in abstract sense and somebody else has won. So in internal aspect, we're focusing on somebody who has lost and exploring why did they lose. So there was a conspiracy for that kind of kicked them out eventually. And then in external aspect, we're focusing on the winner of this situation and we try to explain why did they won in such an unfair manner, you know. So we invent another conspiracy theory on top of that or below that, whatever you prefer. So yeah, it's fundamentally, conspiracy theories are about rationalizing the feeling of injustice, unfairness, disappointment, suffering, blah, blah, blah. All right. So those were the conclusion. And again, for internal, a little bit more details, see my video about Star Wars in the description. I'll give it to you with the proper time code. For PS, I wish to note 3 other things. So one interesting thing which I've uncovered while browsing the Russian internets was this interesting blog post. Unfortunately, I've lost the link to it, like I've read it almost half a year ago. But there was an interesting blog post about lunar hoax, of course. How can we talk about conspiracy theories without mentioning this? So in lunar hoax conspiracy, in particular, what this post was talking about, which I wish to repeat, is that there is a different perception, or rather even different roots of the lunar hoax thinking in the Western world and in the post-Soviet world. And let me briefly explain this to you. So it's just a kind of a funny example. I'm not even trying to tie it to my thinking, although you can do that and I can illustrate that if needed. In the West, the lunar hoax idea appeared as the rather, let's say, indicator of lack of faith in progress. So roughly speaking, people think, no, we're not as cool as to go to the moon, you know. It's this, again, postmodern era, like late 60s, again, 69 was the year of the Apollo 11 landing. So it was already the epoch of postmodernity, you know, after the European protests of 68, Vietnam War, etc., all this counterculture, hippie movement. So it was already postmodernity, roughly speaking. So the faith in progress was kind of already lost by then, or rather, it became more and more acknowledged that no such thing as progress exists, right? So this in some sense, primitive linear thinking of modernity that it's just gonna be all rise, you know, was lost more or less. So then the people have had doubts in technology, and they said, well, it's probably there's something wrong with this lunar program, you know, maybe it didn't exist in the first place. So this is the Western world, and in post-Soviet countries, also a lot of people promote this lunar hoax. Well, a lot of them just hate the United States, so why not promote this? I mean, they praise Soviet Union, let's say, and they hate the United States. So it mostly are old people, like maybe 40 plus at the very least, maybe 50 plus. But there is definitely a mode of thinking in the post-Soviet world which still relates to modernity, this faith in progress. And it also, curiously enough, explains the lunar hoax, or it is compatible, let's say, with the idea of a lunar hoax. So what I'm saying is, well, it's pretty obvious. Again, if we have a progress, let's say, of technology, and we went to the moon, how can we now cannot go to the moon? It means the progress has not just stopped, it just, you know, the level of technology dropped significantly. So that's why the idea of progress, the ideas of modernity can support the idea of a lunar hoax. Whereas the ideas of postmodernity, rejecting the idea of progress, also can support the lunar hoax. It's just such a brilliant discovery of this guy, whoever wrote this post. I mean, yeah, it's really cool. I enjoyed that. So hopefully it was at least a bit amusing for you. Now the second thing I wish to note for this PS, for this video, is that in 2016 there was quite a famous, but I would claim idiotic paper released, and again I'll put the link in the description, which claimed that it basically tried to dismantle conspiracy theories. And as usual, it failed. I mean, when scientists try to deal with culture, they fail miserably, usually. And this is what happened here, I would claim. So the paper claimed that if conspiracy, like the collective who is conspiring, is over 1,000 people, the information about this conspiracy would inevitably leak out in the world, and thus the conspiracy would destroy itself. It would crumble and vanish, basically, right? That was the conclusion of the paper. But let me give you my comments on that. So firstly, well, I don't even mention the questionable, let's say, methods that this paper utilized, but let's just assume they were correct, which is not the case, and true, which is not the case, but let's just believe that, take it at face value, right? And go to the conclusions only. So we assume the paper is correct, everything is correct, and even the conclusions are correct. But the problem is they're not correct, even if you take them at face value. Because if we say that there's a fundamental problem in basic logic here, and I hope you've already catch that from my description. And again, it illustrates how bad scientists are at basic logic, at basic philosophy, at basic critical thinking. And it just pains me to even talk about this. But the problem is that if you assume that the collective of conspirers is more than 1,000 people in total, if you assume that that would lead to information leaking out, well, guess what? All the conspiracy theories we know about them, which means that if they do exist, the information leaked out, because by definition, we cannot know about them if the information didn't leak out. So, you're basically saying, well, if we know about the lunar hoax, probably more than 1,000 people were involved because the information leaked out and we know about lunar hoax theory, at least. This is what the paper is saying, and, well, okay, yeah. Like, does it invalidate the lunar hoax idea? No, because the information leaked out and we've heard about it. So, and the same with all the other examples. So, again, it's a completely moronic, idiotic theory. Paper. So, yeah. Well, I don't know what to add here. And I'll probably just finish with this third point of my postscriptum here. So since we've started with mentioning Star Wars, where I firstly touched on the subject of conspiracy theories, maybe not firstly, but significantly, let's say, let's end with Star Wars 2. So, damn, not 2. Not 2 as a number, but 2. So there exists, and I'm not even sure when it appeared. I didn't make any searches, but I think it appeared a few weeks ago, or maybe a few days ago. Well, it's relatively recent, let's say. There's a conspiracy theory, again about Star Wars, just as I've mentioned in the video about Star Wars, with those conspiracy theories, about the existence of the so-called Lucas cut of the final episode of The Rise of Skywalker. So, as you can see, again, I'll just repeat my points literally from that video about Star Wars. People were so traumatized by The Rise of Skywalker, the 9th episode, that they wanted to somehow rectify the situation, rationalize it, or at least save it in some sense, you know. They're saying, okay, our good boy Lucas wouldn't allow this to happen, so he came and he made his own cut of this stupid movie. And this cut is much better. It might save the Star Wars universe. It's the same type of thinking like Nazi base in Antarctica, or I don't know, or it's being Elvis Presley's evil twin brother who died. You know, if you watched Coffee and Cigarettes by Jim Jarmusch, you know what I'm talking about. This theory that Elvis is alive, it's his evil twin brother who died, who started wearing this stupid white suits, etc. So yeah, it definitely comes from the same source as all the other conspiracy theories, which is the desire to rationalize suffering, disappointment, all those things, which can be dissolved into two separate aspects, which is internal, focusing on those who lost in this conflict, whatever it was, even if there was no conflict really, and external, which focuses on those who won in this conflict, all those evil Jews, you know. All right, hopefully it made some sense. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.